name is Christy Moutsey and I identify as a person with a lived experience of mental illness. One of the problems that we find, I'm part of a community, Embark Cottage. One of the problems we find up in the western suburbs is most of the good mental health services, many of them are in the inner city, and many of our consumers are in the western suburbs because they can't afford to be in the inner city. And we have consumers that have many experiences of mental illness. What do we do about that? How can we get the mental health services into the area where the consumers are?
We of course have always had a poor history about putting services where people in most need are, and human services has been one example of that. Can I say that the New South Wales Mental Health Commission's strategic plan is supposed to be being released. I know it's been supposed to be being released for a while, but I guess it will come out in a pre-election environment as well. And I'm pretty sure that John Fennelly, the Mental Health Commissioner, has been making a case about a redistribution of resources. So not just only to West and South West Sydney, but of course to various parts of rural New South Wales. Once again, you know, one's got to do that in a growth budget environment, so you're not robbing Peter necessarily to pay Paul. But yeah, so I'd have some hope that in that Mental Health Commission strategic plan, there may well be some stuff about targeting new expenditure in areas of highest need which don't have right level of services.
It's my experience that while most resources might be in the inner city, for people who have severe chronic mental health issues, it's still very difficult to get adequate service. It's not my experience that the people I deal with are well cared for, and I think it's a problem of community attitude as well. And I think one of the things that is really important in all these issues is to raise awareness in our communities so that votes change. And the same will happen for mental health and for prisons. While we keep saying people need to go back to prison, or that mental health is not the big problem that it is, if we don't change the votes, we won't change anything.
Being a very political animal, I am attracted to being told that we need to raise the topic for the state election in March. However, is there a way of appealing to the Liberal government?
Part of the solution is to place it onto the radar screen of the Liberal Party from a policy perspective, because neither Liberal Party nor Labor Party policy has in its policy platform the concept of a legally enforceable right to housing. It's not rocket science to produce a legislative provision along those lines. In fact, if you were to word such a provision even into the current homelessness bill, which is before the Federal Parliament, but which is going to be a toothless tiger in its current format, just like the Victorian Charter of Justice, just like the ACT Charter of Justice. If you were to include a section in the same terms as Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the right to shelter, the right not to be homeless, that would put us streets ahead of where we are at the moment. And one way of raising awareness about that is to make a short film for the next Trop Fest festival. A very simple 7-minute film. In fact, I think we should resolve to make that film tonight. Not actually make it tonight, but decide to make it tonight.
I don't think we're that fast.
And it just has to be a day in the life of one homeless person in an Australia in which there is a legally enforceable right to housing in the terms of Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then, like the Gwyneth Paltrow movie, the Sliding Doors movie, the same person in an Australia where there is no such legally enforceable right to housing in those terms, and comparing that person's progress through that 24-hour period in the two Australias, and see which one is a socially just solution and which one isn't.
There is traction that's been got in the UK in particular, okay, with the Conservative government, and in parts of the US, around the notion of cost offsets. In other words, if you actually you reduce the cost on the state of actually stopping social problems happening, okay, to put it as simply as that. And I mentioned before, there's some really interesting evidence, some of it is now Australian-based, that would suggest, just as saying the cost of having somebody incarcerated in prison for a year, round about $78,000, $79,000 in New South Wales. Professor Eileen Baldry recently released a report earlier this year about the life cycle costs of somebody in prison, and in and out of other circumstances, you're talking about several $1 million over a lifetime. So in terms of liberal philosophy, if one can mount an argument that says you actually have cost avoidance through doing sensible things at the front end, that to my mind is an approach that's worthwhile looking at. I mean, both Baird and Constance and the state government here have in fact got heavily involved in the argument about social impact bonds. Now, you know, I'm not a great optimist in terms of saying that, you know, we're going to see a fourfold sort of change, but I do think there are legs on that argument with the Conservative side of politics.
Can I ask how many people are now on the housing register for New South Wales housing? The last time was, how much? 100,000 something. Now that they are selling off their housing stocks around the rocks and all that, and they are not increasing any new homes, how we all expect to bridge that kind of gap? I mean, somebody said, "Oh, you campaign for the liberal with the liberal government to see what they are." The whole ideology or whole philosophy is to get rid of public housing, and they're trying as far as possible to get as much of their stock away and sell it.
Yeah, there are currently 58,000 people on the New South Wales public housing waiting list. The average wait goes from 2 years in parts of rural New South Wales to generally 10 to 12 years in various parts of Sydney. I don't know if the sister wants to talk about the other bit. I've got some views about that too, but I'll...
I just want to say that many of the people I know have been on a housing list for more than 10 years, and they have very little chance of getting housing. And they're people who have got social or emotional or illness of some sort. But there are also people who haven't got those factors, but who just don't make the cut. And there are many people for whom homelessness is the issue of why they were unable to get the letter that was sent to an address that they were no longer able to be at, and so therefore they fell off the list. There's many, many factors of that. There's also the factor of the job network requirements. I would think one of the things that is worth us thinking about is the amount of money that is allocated of federal funding for job network agencies to help people to gain employment. And just even to look at the annual reports of those companies for whom their only income is federal funding and the profits made by their shareholders.
My name's Kieran Howard. You talk about the percentage of people's income currently being spent on housing, which is a basic necessity. My concern is that with the commodification of housing, it's treated as an investment commodity. How does negative gearing, for instance, impact upon the availability of housing, which is a basic need rather than a tradable commodity?
There is no doubt, and I think so many different commentators now do agree that the distortion of the tax system of negative gearing, how it operates in this country, has of course added to the massive speculation in housing costs. Full stop. I mean, anyone who argues that's not the case, well, they're now probably in the minority even of conventional economic thinkers. The issue becomes what do you do about it, of course. There are some who argue you've just got to abolish it completely. There are others who would argue you only should provide, for example, any form of tax concession in that regard if it's an investment in affordable housing, for example. My view is pretty simple about this. The economy serves society, not the other way around. And so therefore you use economic means to get social outcomes. So it's a pretty, I guess that's what the Henry Tax Review was trying to say in 2010 as well too. But yes, there's no doubt that, I didn't make any mention about tax reform in my comments earlier on, but that's got to be part of the question, part of the solution.
Charlie Bradley. Sister, your presentation was the best and most graceful presentation of my political philosophy. I wish I could write it as well as you spoke it this evening. In my question, I wish to address the issue of political will. Time and time again, it's as though with political will we should try and persuade the Prime Minister or the Premier about what they should do. And we appeal to that authority. Why aren't they doing this? Why aren't they doing that? A lot of the elements, the economic elements, have been addressed in the answer so far. But how about this? Let's focus on the not-for-profit people across the board. In developing political will in their relationship with the community, which you spoke about so wonderfully. But the part that I'm seeking to have a better understanding of is the relationship of people in the not-for-profit sector with government, with bureaucrats, and with the sorts of requirements that they need to make to carry out what they would do, what the non-government sector people, the practitioners, their will, how can they carry out their will more effectively, and what needs to be done.
Charles, I believe there are multiple skills, and some of us have skills for one thing and some have skills for another. I have the skill for living with people, for hearing the issues, and for generating a community that can raise awareness of that. I do not have the skills for political savvy. When the green paper or the white paper, whichever one it was called for, I worked with the Edmund Rice Centre and we wrote a submission, and I went and spoke with Tanya Plibisek about housing. And that was probably the only time I have done that level of political, because I knew Tanya and I knew that she would listen to me, and I knew I could speak for the 1 or 2% I represent, whereas I could also recognise she has to deal with the 100%. Her issue isn't, she's for everybody, not for just the little group I represent who are really marginalised. The other way that I handle that, as a not-for-profit group, as a non-government funded group, we do not take government funding, but as a group, I believe that we raise awareness in the community, and I work really hard at that, and that's why we have 700 volunteers from all walks of life, from every strata of society. And that's why things like Our latest project is what we call yellow ribbon dinners, which are just a concept that has not yet taken place. But it's to ask ask someone to invite 6 of their friends to dinner, and we will bring a volunteer who's companioned and someone who's been in prison to share the experience of prison, so that what I believe changes things really changes it. As people hear what the story of prison life is like from someone who's been there, they can't be the same person. They cannot vote the same way or think the same way. So that's the way that I, as leader of a not-for-profit group, handle my political will.
Wonderful.
To get some overall perspective, how do we compare Australia with respect to the other developed nations, not just UK and US, but nations of Europe, Japan, etc.? Are we at the bottom of the pile, or are we middle of the pack? And I suspect we are not at the top. So this will tell us, maybe that will help the people know that there other countries are doing much better, and so we can do a lot better than how we are doing now.
I'll just speak from my perspective on just a very narrow field that I have some expertise in, and that's the prison population. And this year I went to a conference in Singapore which had international representation, and our system is actually going downhill faster than many others.
In terms of rates of homelessness, we're somewhere towards between the middle and the highest level at the moment per 1,000 of population. Certainly it's true. I mean, we just recently, the first time I've ever been in the United States recently, in New York, there are 57,000 people every night living in shelters. Okay, there's 320 million population in the total country. We have something in the vicinity of about 1,500 people living in shelters in New South Wales every night, something like that. That's the scale. But no, we're probably around about 10 or 11 out of the 28 routinely recognised OECD countries in terms of our rate of homelessness. I think one of the really big problems about is not so much looking at homelessness as the rate of inequality. And that's where this country is just absolutely, doing abysmally. We're now in the top 5 of the OECD in terms of increase of rates of inequality. And once again, if you go to you think about the structural causes and stuff, one of the issues that we have here, we just don't distribute our wealth, and unfortunately we're getting worse.
This is not to do with the question, but I just wanted to tell you that last night I was at our shelter, the garden shelter in the Uniting Church, and normally there are 10 people who would be otherwise on the streets who come and sleep there. And it was the loveliest experience of people being cared for. There's a nice tablecloth on, there's hot food at the end of the table that people could choose to help themselves from. And 6 months ago when I went there, all the guys were in bed by that time of night. They just came, made themselves a toasted sandwich, went to bed. Last night, for the hour that I was there, they sat with the 4 or 5 of us and they just chatted. And I want to say, I went home with my heart singing, because it was one of those moments that, having had quite a tough day, I knew that in our community, these men had experienced something that was worth sitting up for. It was worth sitting up for, just to be with other people who were ready to listen to them, who were ready to share with them. And that's the stuff that makes a difference to our lives.
Hi, I know absolutely nothing about homelessness. I've been dragged on by my sister who works with the homeless. But I'm from the UK, and I was interested to hear what you said, because I work in early years and I'm a trustee for a charity that's involved with early intervention. And it's interesting because we are struggling as a charity because we have to show improved outcomes, which is how we prove to the government and get our funding that we are being effective. And it's very, very hard with under fives to show improved outcomes because we can't see the long-term picture.
The holy grail of sort of outcomes and proving cause and effect, of course, is, bedevils us all. One of the things that's been happening here it did come from the Rudd Gillard governments here, was the longitudinal work on the Australian Early Development Index, which has got a 25-year horizon, and which, despite everything else that's happened in Canberra in the last 18 months, is still ongoing. It's probably the only example that we've got of being able to try and measure over, what's a long period of time. And I agree, political cycles in this country are 3 or 4 years, and that's all, and yet we're kind of talking about change that, to prove change, is a 10, 15, 20 years sort of, can I say, it's not spitting on homelessness, but as a director of the board of the Benevolent Society, we have been able to negotiate with the Treasury in New South Wales and to actually agree some measurement about family restoration and stopping kids going into out-of-home care over a 10-year period. And the government's provided some front-end funding as well as private investors in that. And that's based around convincing people that, in fact, some of that program works, does actually have those sort of outcomes. Now that's a bit of a breakthrough, I think,
But isn't the trouble with any of the governments, because we've got elections next year in the UK, it's continuity over the governments. You can't prove anything because the next government comes in and it might be Conservative or Labour in the UK and they change it and you don't get that long-term.
I guess you, in one sense, you've got to hope for two-term governments. Well, I won't say that about the current federal government in Australia, but that is, no, it's true. We live in a political cycle which is ridiculous in terms of policy and that. But there are some things which have a touch of bipartisanship. I can only talk about New South Wales. And part of that is happening in relation to what I've just sort of said. But look, I agree with you, that is the problem about, that's why we've been, I think one of the reasons why we've been unsuccessful at getting the health dollars, for example, moved from the acute end of the system to actually trying to sort of stop, to prevent people getting sick at the front end of the system, which is where we should make the investment, of course.
My question to you, Gary, is the political part of me. I've been a campaigner, as you know, on so many issues over so many years. I think we'd like to know, I'd like to know, and I think the audience would like to know, if we look at the federal cabinet, but also the federal opposition, who are the parliamentarians who actually have a concern about this, and if there was some movement coming up from the grassroots would take some leadership, as that also applies to the state government, to the state leader. That's my question for you. My question for you, Anne, as a believer, as an active social justice person, but as a Catholic, I'm well aware that when the church, in the broadest sense of the term, takes on an issue, and I think the issue has, two issues the church has taken on very well, the Indigenous issue, Indigenous rights, and refugee rights. But it seems as though on a policy level, we never really get very much of statements from the church which would have such an influence. And I'm just wondering, particularly with the new Pope, who is the most progressive reforming Pope we've had ever, and also with the new Archbishop of Sydney, who seems a great improvement on Pell, which is not hard. But do you think it is worth of us who are in the church to put more effort into getting the church, particularly the Catholic Church, which is a social justice one, to actually come out much more politically with statements on this issue.
I'm a woman in the Catholic Church. Got it? It's tough. There are lots of things about the Catholic Church, there are lots of things about the political world, there are lots of things about the social world that I live with, there are lots of things that I find a struggle. But I go for what nurtures my spirit, nurtures my heart, and I work around the rest of it. That's my statement on the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church's social justice statements are profound and wonderful. The statement on prisons, the statement on refugees, the Vatican II documents, but why anyone would want to think a document written 50 years ago is going to speak today if it hasn't spoken for 50 years absolutely blows me away. Right? If 50 years ago it didn't make a difference to my life, why is it going to make a difference today? Let's put the energy into what's today's questions. I think that the stuff that the Catholic Church teaches around transformation, and I think it's very hard to go past the life, death, resurrection of Jesus as a transformative and human experience that says we are not alone, is profound. And when we ritualise that in Eucharist, or when we ritualise that in whatever way we do it in our groups, I think it offers us something. One of the men in our community, who has died now of an overdose, at one of our Eucharists, at the consecration of the Mass, for those of you who are Catholic who understand, this is the moment when we ritualise that the life and death of Jesus is ritualised here in this communion. This is my body given for you. At those words, this man lit a box of matches. Now, we were jammed into this room, so the girl in front of him had her hair, on fire. There was fire everywhere because the box of matches explodes. A month later, I was with him at court, and we went to have coffee while we were waiting for his case to come up. And he said to me, "And do you remember that I lit a box of matches?" And I said, "It's hard to forget, David." It was very hard to forget. And he said, "Why do you think I did that?" And I said, "I thought you were being a smart-ass." And he said, "When Brian said those words, I thought I was going to cry, and I didn't want people to think I was soft." Now, at a really profound level, this man was not Catholic, didn't subscribe to any religion, had a horrendous life and mental health issues. I'd been with him when his mother had said she never wanted to see him again. That's how tough life was for this man. And he heard those words as saying he was not alone. So sometimes rituals are more profound than we can manage. So I guess that's why.
Yeah, but I was really asking you another question. I was asking you, in view of the new Pope, who's so progressive, such a social reformer, and in view of at least having a great improvement on health in our city, do you have any expectation or even mild hope that this might mean the church can come out with strong political statements? Because that's what's needed in the campaigning. What a difference it is when the church has come out on the refugee issue. What a difference it made. When the church came out on the Indigenous rights issue. What a difference it makes. What a difference it would make if the church came out with strong political statements on what governments should be doing, what individuals should be doing. That's my question in view of this changed situation in the church.
I don't hold a lot of hope that that's what's going to happen.
I guess thinking at the state level, thinking of state labour, and thinking of this part of the world, I would have thought that the very first Penny Sharp and Jo Halen, in terms of those three women who presumably will all win, well, two of them will win seats, and depending on what happens in this part of the world, I would have thought that to have them at the Labor sort of level, at the state level, arguing much more strongly around housing and homelessness. And somebody raised the question already about the sale of public housing at Millers Point, etc. Well, of course, you know, the fear is Glebe, the fear is Lilyfield, the fear is etc., etc. So it's all within their seats. So I would have thought, I mean, currently, I don't think State Labor has any policy in this area. But, you know, 4 months is a long time to an election, I guess. As far as the current government goes, you know, it's been a Purgard sort of, you know, you banged her chest and said, you know, I want to crash through on all sorts of things, reforming the homelessness service system, selling public housing, etc., etc. Gabrielle Upton, the current minister, is a member for Vaucluse, you know, reasonable soul, but has no background in this area at all. So I'm not going to put it in anyway. Look, at the federal level, on the government side, the problem is that with the Federation white paper that Abbott talks about, Kevin Andrews, who's the responsible minister in this area, seems to be very happy to go with the Commission of Audit's report, which is basically, it's all the state responsibility. So all we'll do is keep paying Commonwealth rent assistance, but the states can fund public housing, the states can fund the service system. I mean, it's that bad. It is that bad. And so on the Labor side, well, you know, it's about the only person I've heard talking that's not in his portfolio was Mark Butler, who's an environment spokesperson from South, you know, but no, I mean, and obviously Tanya has a, you know, a long-term interest and commitment in this sort of area, but it doesn't register. Well, you know, you tell me if you heard anyone on federal Labor talking about housing or homelessness in recent times at all.
Yes, Tanya on Wednesday.
Well, Tanya on Wednesday, okay, Tanya about the, but as far as, you know, I mean, one thing Rudd did do was exactly the white paper in 2008 and a 5-year sort of, you know, multi-billion-dollar commitment, you know, I mean, that did happen. So, but there's nobody seems to be talking about that at the moment, right? You know, but I would have thought, I mean, obviously the other issue is Western Sydney in so many respects in terms of various issues, and you know, the majority of people that face the risk of homelessness in New South Wales live in Western Sydney, full stop, you know, and they live in the private rental market, and they pay much more than they should be paying in housing costs compared to income. And I suppose, you know, you always think about, well, is that the area that, you know, that's one of the battlegrounds for governments to win or oppositions to win. So, yeah.
Good evening, my name is Ian Jones, and unlike some of you here, I have had direct experience of being homeless. I was homeless from during the period 1998 until 2010, so I've been in public housing last 4.5 years. But my question is this: round about 2003, I think it was, the development in St Leonard's was finishing off, being completed, and I read in the local paper. And I must point out I'm a part-time worker since 1991, and I've had 1 day off work in that time, and I have not been dependent on welfare for most of those years, and I'm still not. So I was with North Shore Community Housing, as it's now called, and they were subletting a place out in Top Right, which was really too far away from where I work in Willoughby. So I read in the local paper, in the North Shore Times, there's this affordable housing development, the Forum, which is still there. So I hightailed it around to North Shore Community Housing, Alexander Street, Crow's Nest, and said, I would like to have one of those because I'd be closer to work. Oh, they said, unfortunately, you have to be in full-time work. And they're for the working poor. And because I'm only a part-time worker, I wasn't eligible. And I was kind of astounded by the whole thing. So I suppose my question is, in the last 10 years, I mean, I suspect no homeless people getting into affordable housing. I mean, is this the case? This is my question. Has anything changed in the last 10 years or so? I suspect it has not.
The answer is yes, there have been, I think. I'll try and answer it in this way. We haven't talked at all tonight about the community housing sector in New South Wales, of which that organisation you mentioned is one. Since 2006, it has grown from managing 13,000 tenancies to about 35,000 tenancies in New South Wales. And it is true that most of that is social housing that's been outsourced to its management. It's not new housing stock, it's public housing stock. But some of it, because some of it has had title transferred to community housing organisations, and they've borrowed against that title and they built affordable housing. I know that there are housing providers like Wentworth out of Western Sydney, St George across middle Sydney, and Bridge here in the inner city, where yes, there have been homeless people who got transitional housing and then got permanent housing, or as much as housing is ever permanent at the moment. So the answer, I think, is yes, but it is sporadic, different community housing providers, different policies, different approaches to doing things. We in Australia have a small community housing sector compared to, well, the UK, compared to Canada, compared to lots of Western Europe. Now, my controversial finishing bit is that part of the reason why we're in such a disaster in this country is because of our obsession with home ownership.
Yes.
part of the reason is we have, we're down to 67% at the moment. We were riding around 70% for the last 35 years. We're at 67%. If we were at 45%, and we actually looked at tenure forms in rental, particularly that were long-term secure with not-for-profit housing providers, we might actually have a better chance of housing many more people at an affordable price. Because we've been obsessed with home ownership and obsessed with quarter-acre blocks and low densities and obsessed with the market, and the tax system does that, basically we've got ourselves to blame because we've got the perfect storm. And, so ultimately it would be great to see that we had less ownership and more security in rental and more ownership of that by both not-for-profit and public agencies.
To our three wonderful guests this evening, each of you have given us very valuable tools and information and insight